I'm your host, Brandy Fleck, and this is Human Amplified. We're on a mission to revamp society by amplifying your humanity. And this is bonus episode 71, a deep dive into Southern masculinity and rage.
I am Mike Hutchinson. Women just kind of are feminine. Masculinity is something you almost have to be initiated into.
Today, guest Mike Hutchinson passionately explores the topic of masculinity and emotions such as rage as a follow-up to telling his adoption story in the previous episode 70. There, we explored how certain familial relationships have impacted his identity and life path. After listening, head over to humanamplified.com/episodes/071 and let us know what your experience of masculinity is in the comments. Remember to subscribe to Human Amplified on your favorite podcast platforms if you haven't already, and leave us a rating and review.
You can easily access rage. Like, that's the one emotion that you can display. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so as a kid, I kind of had a hair trigger emotionally. And so it didn't take much for you to reduce me to tears, like the slightest criticism or anything, and I would just bawl. And so I was raised with a family that had a very traditional, very Southern view of masculinity. And so between my father and my grandfather, they choked that out of me fairly young. In addition to the fact that one of the lessons that I took from a lot of that as a child, and certainly I'm sure that this probably wasn't intentional, was that any sort of emotional display did not end well. And so that was a big part of learning how to manage my emotions. One of the things that I hear women complain about a lot is that, oh, my husband's so unemotional, he's so closed off, so on and so forth. There's an alternate way to look at that. I would invite you to consider looking at it as emotional maturity rather than being closed off.
Okay.
That this is a person who is laboring to handle their emotions in a mature, healthy way, and that doesn't always look like an open emotional display. I will also point out that when men hit puberty, one of the things that happens is that our tear ducts change, where women's don't. Women very much retain the juvenile structure of their tear ducts, which means that they're more shallow. And so men's tear ducts are much deeper. Add to that the traditional, boys don't cry, and you're being taught to rein that in as a child. Here's a good rule of thumb for you. If you see a dude crying, he either just broke something, like he snapped his femur and part of his leg is in the next state, or something is really wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's because it's actually physically more difficult for men to openly weep. And so for a man to reach that point, something's going on. And I was also the kid that cried when I was angry. Like, if you got me really angry, I would start crying. I would later find out when I was seeing the counselor that I mentioned earlier, he had done some work elsewhere, and he was like, so, the one common factor that all of the guys that I've counseled in prison, that are in prison for murder, is that they all cry when they're angry. I'm like, oh, well, that's helpful to know, right? Like, so now I've got something else to be anxious about. Like, am I, 2 days from being a serial killer or something? Like, you're supposed to be helping me, man. That didn't help.
Yeah.
So, but the other piece of that puzzle is that being abandoned as a kid really left me with a lot of rage that was right under the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't always understand that. And that rage was very closely connected to my understanding of adoption, because I had a very poor understanding of my adoption at the time. For me, it was rejection and abandonment.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't always lead to really good places. So when I was in middle school, and this sticks out for me because to this day, it is one of the most frightening experiences that I have had. There was a guy at the middle school that he picked that day to make me his target. And so he was just chirping at me all day long, trying to provoke me and just, nonstop. And it was lunchtime, and we're standing at the far end of the middle school building at Indian Land Middle School in Lancaster County, South Carolina. Big red metal doors at the end of the building. His name was Jason. And I was standing there. His back was to the doors, and I was facing him. My back's kind of towards the gravel area that was there. And he said, the reason your mom gave you up was because, like, you're a worthless piece of shit who's never going to amount to anything. Like, he just really went after me. And that's the last thing that I remember before 3 football coaches were pulling me off him.
Yeah.
And a friend that was a year ahead of me in school was up on the football field where we all had recess. And so he was about 50 or so yards away. And he told me later, he was like, when you hit him the first time, I heard it on the football field. It's like I heard the blow and then his head bounce off the door. And apparently I hit him. And then when he went down, I just climbed on top of him and tried to kill him. I wailed on him. To use a granddaddyism, my grandfather would have said, I beat him like a rented mule. And so that rage was there. And I had been taught through martial arts and other areas how to access that quickly. Because one of the things that you deal with in a self-protection situation is that you certainly can be ambushed, right? You might not see that threat coming. And so you weren't able to evade. You weren't able to escape. You weren't able to de-escalate. And this thing is just on you. And when that happens, you go through what everyone is familiar with, which is the fight or flight reflex, right? What most people forget is that it's not fight or flight. It's fight, flight, or freeze. And so one response to sudden input of that nature is to freeze. You just lock up. And the only way to get out of that is to access rage and indignation. Because when that happens, your body is dumped with adrenaline, right? So you start dealing with, visual exclusion, auditory exclusion, and you've got just massive amounts of adrenaline that are dumping into your body from the adrenal system. At that moment, your body is like a high-end Maserati that's sitting at a stoplight. The light has turned green. You're in neutral and you're just revving the gas. You've got to get it into first. And the way that you get it into first is to go to rage and indignation. Like, how dare you? How dare you put your hands on me? How dare you threaten my life? How dare you put me in a position to take me away from my family, my wife, the woman that I love, potentially my children, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And that's how you break out of the freeze and get back in the fight.
Okay.
And one of the things that means is that you also have to treat every threat that you encounter like it's a level 10 on the threat scale. Like, this is a legitimate threat to my life, because that's the only way to get up the violence curve fast enough. And of course, if that person is not a level 10 threat, you can dial that down. But if this person is a level 10 threat and you treat him like he's a level 3, you're going to regret that, because there's a real good chance that ends with you in the hospital.
Okay.
And so all of that is in my background, and all of that feeds into the fact that anger and sheer rage is always real close to the surface and real easy for me to access, because my entire life, the ability to access rage was what kept me safe. And so I'm dealing with a guy that wants to pound my head in. The only way to deal with that is to go to rage and indignation.
Okay.
I'm in the Army. The way to deal with that, and the way to deal with the threats that you're presented with in the military, is to deal with it through rage and indignation. If you face an ambush in the military, the way that you deal with the ambush is not by running away. It's by turning into the ambush and executing an immediate counterattack. And so you don't shrivel up and freeze. You turn into the guns and you start putting rounds down range. You're working the door in a club where people are getting stabbed every other night, and where guys are going to violence at the doorway every night because you won't let them in. The way to deal with that threat is go to rage and indignation. And so I have taught myself there's a neurological channel that's just carved into my brain that'll take me straight to anger very, very quickly.
Okay.
Now, the downside of that is that one of the other things that kind of came out of that is that I also have spent a great deal of my life focusing on the intellectual and not the emotional, because the intellectual was safe. I don't have to feel anything there. And my emotions often I didn't see as very safe.
Okay.
And so when you put all of those things together, what you wind up with is a person who has easy access to rage and anger and who often can't identify other emotions that he feels. And so it is very often even difficult for me to identify happiness.
Okay.
Because I don't expect to be happy. I expect to be rejected. I expect to be miserable. And so because of that, identifying happiness, identifying sadness, identifying those other things are extremely difficult for me.
Okay.
And so if I'm dealing with something that's a highly emotional topic for me, it may take days or even weeks afterwards for me to be able to take that knotted ball of emotional yarn and start picking it apart and identify, oh, okay, so I felt this. That's what that emotion was. And I felt that. That's what that emotion was. And so that's a very difficult thing for me.
Okay. Okay. I didn't expect to go this route, but I would love to talk about healthy masculinity versus toxic masculinity. And it sounds to me like you're just, as a child, you were a highly sensitive person. And so, because of the interactions that you had, you learned that it wasn't safe to be highly sensitive. So, what are your thoughts? I mean, how did you've adjusted and you adapted how you had to adapt?
Yeah.
And now you've got this one emotion you have easy access to.
Right. I don't think it's, first, I would say that I don't think it's entirely fair to chalk that up to, or to chalk that completely up to masculinity or even to toxic masculinity.
Okay.
I have my own issues with the concept of toxic masculinity. I think that we have taken something that's truly a very narrow band and a very narrow category, and we've started to take it and apply it across a lot of normal, healthy male behaviors.
Okay.
And so I am very reticent even to use the phrase toxic masculinity now because it is so liable to being misunderstood. However, that being said, you can't walk through life as a raw, exposed nerve. Like that's not healthy either. When just everything's coming at you 1,000 miles an hour and you're constantly in this state of emotional turmoil. At some point, you have to be able to deal with that. And for the sake of complete and total clarity and for the sake of complete and total honesty, I don't buy the theory of evolution. However, I could, based on all of the reading that I've done in evolutionary theory, make a case that what's mostly chalked up as men being closed off emotionally is actually an evolutionary adaptation to the environment in which we live. And so that's something that has to be considered. Like, even if you don't buy the theory of evolution in the way that I don't, there's still the reality that we come from cultures that are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years old. And so all of the learned behavior that has kept us alive and healthy over those thousands upon thousands of years has been handed down to us. And they've been handed down to us for a reason, because they work. And so there is something to be said for being that strong, stable individual who isn't being pushed about by their emotions and constantly it's kind of like, oh, it's just that person that can't get themselves under control. So I'm grateful for that. I really am. I'm grateful for the fact that I was taught that as a kid, because if I had stayed that super sensitive child and I had stayed that raw nerve that was just exposed to everything that was flying at them, I would not have survived. You can't live that way. I would have died very young, because I've always had a bent towards darkness. I've always had a bent towards depression. I am bipolar. That is something that I live with. Suicidal ideation was the norm for me through high school and in the Army. And so if you take all of those things and you put them together, dead man walking, baby. That's what you've got. The other side of that coin is that there is such a thing as being too stable, maybe, or too unmoved
Rigid.
by the world that's around you. And so for me, emotion shows up in really strange places. You could take me out in the front yard tonight and beat me with a sledgehammer, like the handle from one. And I probably wouldn't make a sound or shed a single tear because you don't show weakness. Put me in front of a television and they play the national anthem before a baseball game, and I'm reduced to blubbering tears. And that's where it shows up. And I know that this probably sounds so stupid to people that are listening to this, but a great comeback story for me will almost always reduce me to tears. Like seeing somebody that has faced horrid circumstances and a person who has had everything against them explode into success. And like I'm getting teary eyed sitting here talking about it. Some books do that for me. So I was a huge fan of Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. Very much a fantasy genre similar to The Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien. And I grew up with those characters. Like the first book, I think, came out in like 1990 or 1993. And the last book was published just a few years ago. And so these were characters that have gone through my whole childhood with me. And there was one in particular. It was a little boy whose parents were killed in this story. And the whole character arc, what drives this character is wanting to find the people that killed his family and get vengeance. And he's taken very much under his wing by another character named Noel. And he's an older man that helps kind of initiate him into the world. And then Noel is killed in the second to the last book. And part of the story of this novel is one piece of the magical element is that there's this horn, the horn of Valere, that can call dead heroes back from the grave. And that this horn is going to be sounded before the last battle. And that these heroes will return and help defeat the Dark One, Shaitan, who's trying to overtake the world. And there's this moment in the final book where the little boy is being attacked by Trollocs, they're like orcs, and he's hiding under this cart where they're trying to reach him to kill him and eat him. And he's curled up in a ball with the case that the horn is in, and finally pulls the thing out and blows it. And when he does, the orcs effectively start falling around him, and standing over him is Noel, who's been called back from the grave. And he's there to protect this little boy. And if you're listening to this, you could tell how much that affects me. Like, that just kills me.
Yeah.
And so these aren't even real people, for God's sake. Why do I care?
Because you relate.
It's a Yankees game. For the love of God, it's not important, right?
I don't know.
But there's something about that I find particularly moving. And so maybe I should have better access to some of those emotions. Maybe that would have been a better thing if maybe I had been initiated into masculinity in a different way. And maybe there is a healthier expression of what it is to be a man. But what I could say is that it's worked for thousands of years, and it certainly worked in my family. And it's worked for me with all of its flaws. And God knows there are plenty.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the more interesting things that happened when my wife and I were dating and we were getting ready to get engaged and I met her parents for the first time, her dad learned about my military background, which has not come up in this interview, and I'm grateful that it hasn't, because it's something that I don't particularly enjoy talking about. But I found out later that my father-in-law told my then girlfriend, he is an extraordinarily dangerous individual, but you will never be safer anywhere on the planet than you are with him because of his character. And I think that there's something to be said for taking that really dangerous aspect of masculinity,
Mm-hmm.
which is an extremely important piece of masculinity, and wedding it to high moral character. And so, you have the statement in the Gospels where Jesus says that if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other to them so that they could strike you on that one also. Amen. But you have to have a cheek to turn first. And we have raised so many weak men, and we have raised so many unhealthy men that what we're getting isn't helping us now. So what you're getting is generally speaking, one of two things. You're either getting boy children, right? Like he's 30 years old, but he hasn't grown up.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not dangerous to anybody, right? He's a cream puff. Right?
Sorry, I know it's not a funny topic,
Right,
but cream
right,
puff, funny.
right. Put him outside the door of the club that I worked when I was in New York, and in 2 seconds, he's either going to be on the floor knocked out or he's going to be reduced to a puddle of tears because he's not going to be able to take what's coming at him.
I hear you.
The other thing that you get are boys that are never taught how to control that dangerous aspect of their character.
Okay.
And those boys walk into a high school with an AR-15 and kill people.
Now that's an interesting statement for sure.
What we want is between those two extremes. And that's what we're aiming for. And so I say this in recognizing that I am completely biased in this regard. But one of the institutions that used to help men find that middle ground between not being dangerous at all and being dangerous in a way that was really, really unhealthy for society and that was extraordinarily dangerous to societal stability was the church. Sadly, the church isn't that anymore either. And so we have a masculinity crisis on our hands right now. And no one is finding a solution to it because on the left, you have folks that want to beat men over the head with the idea of toxic masculinity and tell them that their sexuality is toxic, that their emotional life is toxic, that their very being is toxic. On the other side, you've got the guys that want to suck you into hardcore alt-right, or the worst of the alt-right, I should say, and militia movements and those sorts of things, because they recognize that this guy's never had a dad. This guy's never been initiated into masculinity. He's an easy target, and he's furious. That never ends well. Never through history. That guy shoots up a school. That guy becomes a dictator. That guy becomes a tyrant in his own home, beats the fire out of his wife, abuses his children, and goes on to destroy everything he touches. That's what happens. And the church isn't there to help anymore because the guys that we're producing, that we're putting in pulpits now, are cream puffs. They are. And I hate to say that because they're my people. Right? But you graduated from your Christian elementary school, your Christian middle school, your Christian high school, your Christian college. You went to seminary. You've never had a job in the real world. You've never faced real difficulty. You've never been punched in the mouth. You've never had a real girlfriend other than the girl that you're dating. You have no experience of the real world, and we're going to put you in charge of 400 people. Yeah, that's going to turn out well.
Yeah.
That's going to turn out great. And the whole way through, the guys that we select are the guys that sat on their hands and were mama's little boy, and they were never dangerous, and they had their hair perfectly parted. And that's the guy you put in charge of the church. Let's be fair. The guy that wrote the Psalms used to kill people for a living.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So, like, if you want to give me a worship leader for the church, don't give me a guy in a lemon yellow sweater vest, drinking decaf, driving a cabriolet. Give me a guy that's got some combat time under his belt. Okay? And that doesn't have to be physical combat. But give me a guy that's been through something.
Yeah. Life experience.
Yeah. And the only way that you can gain healthy masculinity is through other men.
Okay.
And so how do you get initiated into that? Well, first through your father, and then through a community of men that are able to shore up the weak spots in your father's own explanation of masculinity and to make you better in those areas and to tone you down in areas where you're wrong. That's how you create healthy masculinity. But where do men go for that now? Can't have men's only clubs anymore. Those are gone. They're gone the way of the dodo. You get a group of 100 men together and try and talk about this stuff, and then women show up and want to know why they can't be part of it. And then they wedge their way into it, and having a woman there when you're trying to deal with these things fundamentally alters the nature of the conversation. Right? Or, this was my personal favorite, when the Me Too thing started, I noticed a bunch of men that started posting about their own experience with sexual assault. And then women came out of the woodwork saying, how dare you hijack this? Why can't you have your own movement? And I lost my temper with a woman over that. I was like, how dare you?
Yeah.
Because when we start our own movement and we start talking about this stuff among ourselves, you know what happens? You guys show up and you tell us to shut up and sit down because we don't have it as bad as women do. And we're supposed to just suck it up and take it. And so even when we want to deal with those areas where men need to deal with these things that are highly emotional subjects and they need to work those emotional issues out, even the people that say that they want that don't. They don't want to let them do it.
Yeah. Okay.
We have taken men in our country and men in our churches and men in our homes, and we have put them in a catch-22 where they cannot win no matter what they do. And you wonder why you can't find decent husbands. You wonder why you can't find decent fathers. You wonder why you've got 40-year-old women who say, where did all the good men go? You spent the last 50 years killing them.
Shit.
You got what you wanted. You cut their
Oh,
balls off. You got what you wanted. How do you like it?
okay.
Not working out so well, is it? It's the same thing that I tell my friends that are politically on the left. And again, I am a card-carrying libertarian, so a pox on the Republicans and the Democrats. I don't care for either one of them,
Hmm.
right? But my friends that are on the political left, years and years, arguing and bemoaning the fact that we had the religious right, and that they hated the religious right, and that the right needed to be separated from its religious base. Donald Trump is the most least religious president that I can think of. How's that working out for you? You wanted a non-religious right? You got it.
Yeah.
What do you want now? Be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it.
Wow.
Sorry,
That
I'll
was
climb down off
intense.
my pulpit here, but I am extremely passionate about men and about men's issues and the way that
Yes.
I see men treated in larger society.
Yeah.
I see men being abused by their wives. No one believes them. When the cops show up, the cops have been indoctrinated that it doesn't matter if he's sitting there with broken ribs and blood pouring down his face, he's the one who goes to jail. A great fan that I grew up with going to high school was getting beaten by his wife night after night. Eventually, it got to the point where when it would happen, he would go stand outside with all the floodlights on around his house so that when the neighbors called the cops, they would know that he was the one being beaten, not her.
Yeah.
That's the extreme that he had to go to. And when the cops showed up, you know what he was told? You better pray that when we show up, she doesn't have so much as a broken fingernail. Because if her fingernail is split and you're standing here with a stab wound, you're going to go to jail and get charged with abusing her. That's how we treat men. Oh, and here's one better. We tell men their entire lives that if you just grow up and you just do all the things that we want you to, and you join the army, or you join the military, and you go and you sacrifice your lives for these things, that we'll build a monument to you, or we'll make you a statue, or we'll put you in the history books, right? What does that cost us? We've destroyed the flower of masculinity in its very bud, and we've left a gaping hole in its place. And those are the men you want to turn around and tell they're toxic? How dare you? How dare you do that? How dare you walk up to the guy that's at a construction site and tell him that he hates women? You're living in a house built by men. You're running an air conditioner built and installed by men that was invented by men. You're using an internet connection that was developed mostly by men. You're using a microphone that was developed mostly by men. We all want to talk about the glass ceiling. Nobody wants to talk about the glass cellar. Men are the majority of the ones in prison. Men are the majority of suicides. 98% of workplace death. Men are over 3/4 of the journalists that have been killed in the last 15 years. Men die day in, day out. Nobody cares. You remember Bring Back Our Girls, right? You had that hashtag Bring Back Our Girls when the girls in Nigeria were kidnapped by Boko Haram and were carried away and sold into slavery,
Uh-huh.
right? You had Michelle Obama on the internet holding up a sign, Bring Back Our Girls, which I thought was hysterical, because when I saw that, I was like, really? Look across the dinner table. You see that guy? That's the guy you need to talk to about bringing those girls back. What am I going to do? Show up in Nigeria with a sharpened Bible? Or like, I can't get those girls back. Talk to your husband. That dude can send some SEALs and solve it. Right? But it's Bring Back Our Girls. Bring back our girls. Look at all of the incidents of violence from Boko Haram before that point. In every place that they went to, because they were attacking schools, primarily Christian schools, but schools in general, every place that they went to, they set the girls free after telling them, go back to your families, go under the care of your father, wear the burqa, meet a nice man, have 17 babies, and obey Islam. Subhana wa ta'ala, right? They killed all the boys by the hundreds, and nobody cared. Kidnapped 20 girls from a school. It's world news. Tell me again that we care about men. Tell me that we care about their problems. Please try and convince me of that, because I don't see it. Read a news article about a major catastrophic event, earthquake, building comes down. 400 people killed, including a grandmother, and 15 women. They never mention the men. That's how you get That's how you get where we are right now. But again, I bring this stuff up and people look at me like I'm crazy. They call me a misogynist. They tell me I'm a woman hater because I'm concerned with men. We're paying the price, and the price has been real high.
Okay.
And we're going to keep paying it until we fix it.
All right. Well, that's a lot to think about. And I'm glad I asked you about it. And there is no judgment here. There's no judgment here. I am happy to hear what you are saying.
Oh, well, I'm sorry I ranted at you, but it is what it is.
Okay. That's okay.
It was bound to happen. At some point, it was bound to happen. So.
All right.
Subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and learn more at humanamplified.com.